Okay, good afternoon, comrades and friends. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to our seminar on Palestine. It's a seminar that will be dedicated to the memory of Shireen Abu Akleh, the journalist who was murdered a few days ago by the Israeli army. We thought that this would be an occasion to remind ourselves of the whole history that has gone and led to the murder that took place. I wonder whether people have thought about how Israelis threw Palestinian people out of the homes and businesses and farms that they had been living in for generations, and replaced those people with Jewish people. People are encouraged to believe that somehow the Palestinians are terrible terrorists. But I used to ask my mother, well, had the Germans invaded, and having invaded, had they thrown us out of their homes and established German families, what do you think we would be doing? So one of these things that Hawara Bra, who will be presenting today, will be addressing is why these terrible crimes that were committed against the Palestinian people and continue to be committed against the Palestinian people really don't receive any kind of shock and horror in our media. And on the contrary, we're constantly reminded that because of the Holocaust, we should allow the Jews to get away with anything. Well, the Holocaust, of course, was frightful and inexcusable, but the answer really isn't Israel. It isn't perpetrating horrors on millions of Palestinian people. That can't be the way forward. But anyway, let me hand you over to Hawara Bra, who will present on the question of Palestine for you.
Thank you, Comrade Chairperson. As the Chairperson has already explained, this seminar is dedicated to the memory of the famous and much loved Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was brutally murdered by the fascist Israeli army on the 11th of May. This murder comes on top of what Israel has been doing for close to 100 years. We have to take ourselves back to the whole question of Zionism. As it is asserted by, contrary to what is asserted by the Zionists, that Zionism is a Jewish project, the truth of the matter is, it's not a Jewish project, it's an imperialist project. Far from being the movement for the liberation of the Jewish people, Zionism has actually served only to completely subjugate the Palestinian people and the Israeli people, the Jewish populations everywhere, to a mental servitude, and has much diminished them in this process. For the last few years in Britain, the question of anti-Semitism has become quite a heated one. And it happened to coincide with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has been known throughout his life to support the Palestinian people's struggle for rights, for self-determination, etc. So the Zionists were frightened that if Jeremy Corbyn became the leader, as he did become, of the Labour Party, and if he managed to become the Prime Minister, it would be a terrible blow to the state of Israel. But they were justified in their fears I do not know, but the fact is, this is what prompted them. So they conducted a campaign from day one against Jeremy Corbyn or anybody who was associated with the question of defending the right of Palestinian people. So Jeremy Corbyn, newspaper headlines were, Labour has a problem with the question of anti-Semitism. And Jeremy Corbyn has not been able to stop anti-Semitism in his party. The same thing happened with a Labour MP called Naz Shah, for the simple fact that he had posted a picture of a map of Israel and superimposed it on a map of the United States and put the caption, "Problem solved." Now, she was vilified, she was bullied into apologizing for that. In fact, she was doing no more than picking up this particular map from a web of the famous anti-Zionist Jewish writer and author and activist Norman Finkelstein. The same thing happened with Ken Livingstone, because Ken Livingstone defended the right of Palestinian people. He said Hitler was a Zionist. Now, that's not the language that I would use to describe Hitler. But there is a basis to what Ken Livingstone was saying, that there is a coincidence and complete agreement between the ideology of Nazism and the ideology of Zionism. I come to that later on in my brief introduction today. And all these campaigns against Jeremy Corbyn, against Ken Livingstone, against anybody else, in the words of Norman Finkelstein, these campaigns occur at regular intervals, correlating with Israeli periodic massacres and the consequent isolation of Israel. And so the last one started after the 2012 war that Israel had waged against the Gazan people, and it gave Israel such a bad press. So the whole question of anti-Semitism was rigged up. And he said these campaigns are initiated, to use Finkelstein's words, by dull-witted creeps of the type of Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian, for the sole purpose of diverting the attention of ordinary people away from the real suffering of the Palestinian people. Nobody brings out the question of the suffering of Palestinian people. Since 2000, 10,000 Palestinian people have been killed by the Israeli forces. Do you hear that? Does anybody know that? That there are several thousand prisoners without any trial in Israeli jails, and they include several hundred children who are locked up there. As far as Zionism is concerned, it's a racist ideology. And it was put forward by Theodor Herzl in his book written in 1895 called The Judenstaat, i.e. the Jewish state. And this book and Herzl's teachings are anti-socialist and very, very reactionary indeed, and racist to core. He promised to the various powers who would help him achieve this question of a separate state whatever he thought they would like to hear. To the German Emperor, Kaiser, and to the Emperor of Russia, he promised that by creating a Jewish state, he'll take away the Jewish population away from these countries, thus free them of the presence of the Jews, and into the bargain, what it would do would be to actually weaken the socialist movement, because the Jews were very prominent in the democratic and socialist movement. And if they were taken away, then they would not face the specter of revolutionary movements rising against them. At the same time, he said Jews are very powerful in the stock exchange. And by taking these Jewish capitalists away, he would thereby weaken the competition that they offered to the non-Jewish capitalists. This, of course, appealed to the capitalists very much. So this whole trope of portraying the Jews as both Bolshevik on the one hand and being bankers and capitalists, long before it was started by other races, It was started by Herzl. He is actually the author of this whole thing. And he then also said, if such a state was to be formed, it would be a beacon of democracy in a world of barbarism. So there's a fair bit of racism that only Europeans can offer civilization and others are barbaric. Now, these ideas of Herzl were not new. They'd been put forward by a couple of Zionists in the Russian Empire. The most famous of them was Leo Pinsker. But the main contribution of Herzl was that he actually founded the World Jewish Conference, where the Jews could meet regularly and discuss these matters, gave a certain of kind of organizational form to the dispersed Zionists all over the place. And what's more, he realized early on that no Jewish state could be brought into existence without the patronage of one or the other powerful imperialist countries. So he would endeavor to meet the heads of state of these countries in order to propagate the idea of a Jewish state. Herzl was not a particularly religious person. He even said religion is a bind, it subjugates people mentally. He was not religious. He didn't read Hebrew. And what's more, Herzl didn't care where the Jews got a state. It could be Uganda. The Ugandans are very lucky that it wasn't finally chosen. But of course, the very, very nutty Zionists wanted nothing but Israel because of this long, antiquated, so-called connections with that area where the Jewish religion originated. So he was happy to have a place in Argentina. He was happy to have a state anywhere in the world as long as Jews could have a state of their own. Now Herzl was instigated into that activity by a very well-known affair called the Dreyfus Affair. A Jewish officer in the French army called Dreyfus was wrongly charged with treason, and he was convicted. And his conviction, once it was realized by the ordinary working people of France, was wrong and unjustified, they conducted serious campaigns against that conviction, and in the end Dreyfus was released. Now from that you could draw two conclusions. The right conclusion was that there is only one protection for minorities living among a majority, and that is the solidarity between the working people of the majority and the minority. The other solution is that these majority are inherently racist, anti-Semitic, and there's no solution for that except that the Jews must have a state of their own where nobody discriminates against them. And that's a wrong conclusion, and we're facing the consequences of that right up to our day. So that is the conclusion that that was reached by Herzl in his Judenstaat. Now, what actually makes the Zionism closer to Nazism are three things. Both of them are fiercely anti-communist. Secondly, they both rely on the kind of folkist racism. And thirdly, they actually both believed that Germany was not a place for Jews. The Nazis, of course, wanted to get rid of the Jews. They had this peculiar part of their ideology and their program to rid Germany of the Jewish presence, perhaps even the whole of Europe from Jewish presence. And the Zionists said, good, this is the final proof of the bankruptcy of the assimilationist ideology that has been followed by majority of the Jews. Now is our time because we can have our own state. We do not want to assimilate with anybody, etc. Every time the Nazis came up after they established their rule, every time they came up with new acts which would repress and discriminate against Jews, they welcomed them because this was something that would give credence to the ideology of Zionism. In 1933, the Nazis called for a boycott of all Jewish businesses. Now, in response to that call, the Jewish population of the United States of America, and at that time there were at least 2 million Jews in America who'd migrated between the 1870s and the First World War. 2 million Jews had gone to live in America. So they were very prominent in retail trade, and they were going to boycott German goods. Now this was a blow to Germany because, Germany was in the midst of economic crisis. They didn't want any embargo on their goods reaching. And the Zionists, of course, helped by persuading the Jewish business people in America not to boycott German goods and thereby save their skin, if you like. And in June 1933, that is soon after the Nazis had called for a boycott of Jewish business, the Zionist Federation of Germany sent a memorandum to the Nazi Party offering collaboration between them, provided that they would support the Zionist demand for a separate state in Palestine. And in one of the sentences in that letter was, if you agree with that, we shall wage no battle against thee, only against those who would resist thee. So that's what the Zionist Federation of Germany said. Then 2 years later came the new repressive laws called the Nuremberg Laws, which actually prohibited intermarriage between Germans and Jews. Now, it was very difficult to find who was a German, who was a Jew, because they've been living together for a long time, and there were a lot of intermarriages between Jews and non-Jews. They or anyone who was born of such a marriage was deprived of citizenship. Anyone who was born out of extramarital relationship between a Jewish and a non-Jewish person was deprived of citizenship. And in fact, all Jews were deprived of citizenship. So you couldn't get a passport, you couldn't get a visa to get out of the country. And all the same, the Zionists saw Hitler's victory as the final proof of the bankruptcy of assimilationism. You would remember there's a famous German journalist, Emil Ludwig. He also had an interview with Stalin on one occasion, who had recently been converted to Zionism. And what would he say? Hitler would be forgotten in a few years, but he shall have a beautiful monument to him in Palestine. Because, he was making it possible for support for Zionism, A, by his discrimination, and B, by allowing a certain degree of emigration from Germany to Palestine. During the same period, the Zionists, the Jewish agency, which was actually in Palestine at that time, which functioned as a kind of government for the Jews in the mandated territory of Palestine, entered into an agreement which is known as the Hawara Agreement. Hawara in Hebrew means transfer, whereby the Nazis allowed Jewish business people to transfer some of their wealth from Germany into Palestine in the form of agricultural machinery, because the Zionists were trying to build a state and they wanted to build agriculture in Palestine. And in return, of course, the Zionists had to agree to persuade everybody else not to boycott German goods. And later on it was extended to such an extent that German goods were being sold in several places, including Palestine, which gave the fascists in Britain, the fascists of Sir Edward Mosley, the chance to say, Here we are told to boycott German goods, but the Jews themselves are propagating the sale of German goods everywhere in the world, including in Palestine. So that was something which was used by fascists in Britain. It was only in 1938 that finally, after what is known as the Kristallnacht, that is when when Nazi fascist hoodlums came and smashed businesses that were owned by Jews in Germany, and their businesses were closed down. And it was only after that that the Nazis basically banned the Zionist Federation of Germany. Now, the Zionists make three assertions: that Jews invented Zionism. Secondly, that Jews are a Semitic people. Thirdly, that the state of Israel ought to be and shall remain an exclusively Jewish state. All these three claims are false. Zionism is not an invention of the Jews. It's an imperialist project, it's an imperialist construct, and it has been pursued actively for a very long time in Europe, and it's the product of European, if you like, geopolitics. The question of the prominence of Jews first arose during the period of Reformation, and when Luther, who had raised the banner of revolt against the Pope, put forward certain ideas, like they put emphasis on the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament. They had even some sections from the Testament removed, which were not considered by the Orthodox Jews as part of the Bible. Secondly, they at the same time, Luther said that Bible was the final authority on the question of religion, and not the Pope. And they emphasized the importance of Jerusalem as opposed to Rome. So these were political things that had nothing whatever to do with Jewish liberation. Luther was using it for his own purposes to fight against the Pope. And of course, Luther's idea, he even wrote a pamphlet, Jesus Christ was born a Jew, to show that Judaism is not very different from Christianity, because the founder, if you like, or the originator of Christianity, Jesus Christ, himself was a Jew. That was something which was anathema to the Pope. Jews had been expelled from Britain by Edward I in 1290. And before expelling, he had cancelled all the debts that he owed to the Jews, because Jews were fairly prominent in the world of finance. And anybody who wanted to even launch crusades borrowed money from Jewish business people. And so he cancelled the debts and expelled them. And for the first time after that, Cromwell admitted the Jews into Britain. And the reason for Cromwell admitting the Jews into Britain was simply straightforward business reason. Jews had been prominent in the financial and trading circles of Amsterdam, that is in the Netherlands, and they had helped Netherlands to capture a lot of trade and a lot of business through their business acumen, through their capital, and their know-how. So Cromwell wanted to attract the Jews to Britain to undermine Holland, which had taken advantage of the English Civil War and diverted a lot of business away from everywhere else in the direction of Amsterdam. And Jews were very, very few. By the end of Cromwell's reign, which was about 9 or 10 years, there were no more than something like 5,000 or 6,000 Jews in Britain. Even 100 years after Cromwell, there were only 25,000 Jews in Britain. But what is true is that they were admitted to Britain, they were able to carry on business. And then comes the French Revolution in the late 18th century, 1789. And that gives all the civil liberties to the French Jews as were available to non-Jews. But of course, both Napoleon and the British state were very keen competitors against each other. They wanted to use the Jewish question in order to help them economically. Napoleon, in his fight against Russia and in his economic battle against Britain, wanted to enlist the services of the Jews. And since Jews were important in business, and particularly in the financial part of it, they both wanted the support of the Jews. Napoleon even called a conference called Sanhedrin, which is really named after some ancient Jewish organization of Jewish elders which existed in 300 or 400 BC in France to enlist their support. But that was a total failure, because the Jews who had just obtained their civil liberties never heard of Palestine, didn't want to go to Palestine. They wanted to have nothing to do with it. And when Napoleon said to them, Jerusalem will be their capital, and they told him in no uncertain terms, Paris is our Jerusalem. That was their position. And they would have nothing to do that. And in Britain, of course, the biggest propagators of the idea of a Jewish state and having a homeland for the Jews were non-Jews. So the origins of Zionism are not Jewish, but non-Jewish. And the two most prominent figures in the 19th century were Lord Shaftesbury and his son-in-law, Lord Palmerston. They both propagated it. And then, of course, later on, the Suez Canal in the 19th century is opened, and there's a trade route all the way to India. And on the way, you would need coaling and loading and unloading facilities. And they wanted to have somebody in Palestine who they could rely on to look after their interests. Now, the Russians could rely on the Orthodox Church. The French could rely on the Catholics. But Britain had nothing there. So they wanted to have somebody who would look after their interests. So they propagated the idea of a Jewish state. But the problem with this was that the idea of a Jewish state was extremely unpopular among the Jews. They'll have nothing to do with it. And it's epitomized by none other than Sir Edwin Montagu, who was a only Jewish member of the British cabinet, and he was the Secretary of State for India. As soon as the Balfour Declaration had been issued, he wrote a memorandum to his cabinet colleagues, in which case he said the Balfour Declaration is a piece of anti-Semitism, because what it does is it tells the Jews that their homeland is in Palestine and not in Britain or wherever they come from. And it gives any government the opportunity to say to the Jews at any time, you are not citizens of this country, and to deprive them of that citizenship. And he regarded the Zionists, who were a very tiny minority among the Jews, as mischievous elements who ought to be described as cranks and nutcases. And he even wanted the Jewish organizations to be banned. Of course, his voice was not heard. And other prominent members of the Jewish community, like the president and the secretary of the board of British Jews, both of them opposed the Balfour Declaration. But of course, the British persisted with these schemes. It was a British retired general and a former governor of one of the provinces in Australia called George Gawler, who invented the phrase, Palestine is a land without people, waiting for the Jews, a people without land. So it's not a Jewish slogan, it's a slogan issued by Gawler, who had been responsible for the transport of convicts from Britain to Australia at the rate of about 200 a month. So he had good knowledge and know-how about how to settle people who are displaced, and he hoped to repeat the same thing with Jews. Jews were not convicts, but persuade them to go to Palestine and settle there. And the Balfour Declaration promised that Her Majesty's government would do everything possible to facilitate the establishment of a home for Jews in Palestine. The second part of the statement also said, it being understood that nothing shall be done which will harm the rights, property and civil rights of the non-Jewish population of Palestine. That part, of course, has been honored in breach. It's only the first part that has been, if you like, carried out. Now, when at the time Britain issued the Balfour Declaration through its Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, who had earlier been Prime Minister of Britain, Palestine didn't belong to Britain. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. So it was Britain promising to a people who had no connection with Palestine an area which it did not own. But of course it acquired that after the defeat of the Axis powers in the First World War, and Turkey was on the side of Germany. So the Versailles Conference was maneuvered into a position whereby Britain received the mandate for Palestine. They didn't call it a colony, which it effectively was, because it was not by that time become not a very nice word to have. So they had the mandate under the then League of Nations to administer Palestine as a mandate on behalf of its people until such time as they were brought up to maturity and could be given charge of their own state. So it was really not an idea that originated with the Jews. Jews didn't invent Zionism. In fact, it's Zionism that was invented by non-Jews who almost to the last person were anti-Semitic themselves. Balfour, for example, opposed the admission of Jews into Britain after the First World War, about the time of the First World War, through the Aliens Act, which prevented Jews from Eastern Europe fleeing persecution from Tsarist Russia coming to Britain, because he said, we know the evils that come from unrestricted immigration of Jews into this country. So, but being anti-Semitic doesn't prevent them from being on the best of terms with Zionism, because their ideologies coincide, if you like. Second point that the Zionists make is that they're Semitic people. Well, all historical, genetic, archaeological, and other research shows that Jews, modern-day Jewry, is not of Semitic origins. They are actually descendants from the Khazars, who were convert to Judaism and who had established a state called the Khazar Kingdom in the middle of the 8th century. It lasted about 300 years till it was till the Khazar Kingdom was beaten by the Duke of Kiev, and what remained of it was finally finished off with the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. And then through subsequent partitions of Poland 2 or 3 times in the 18th century, most of the Jews came under the rule of the Tsarist Empire. All this has been well documented, even by people who are well-known authors of Jewish origin, like Arthur Koestler, who was a Hungarian Jew, and Paul Wexler, who I think still teaches at a university in Israel. And they show that the modern day Jews are descendants from the Khazars. They've got absolutely nothing to do with the Semites of earlier days. As to the assertion that it's a Jewish state and will remain forever, so, well, that is a question which has got to be settled by history. I do not personally think that this will take place. Britain was able to push forward the question of Judaism after the assassination of Alexander II in Russia. There were repressive laws passed against the Jews because the Jews were suspected of having participated in the murder of that. There's no historical evidence of that. They were wrongly accused, but all the same, they passed anti-Jewish laws. And Britain got the opportunity to actually intervene on behalf of the poor old oppressed Jews and plead with the Russian government not to discriminate against them, just as they would do in Ukraine today or anywhere else, wherever they find some reason because of their own economic interest. And Britain sent various people, well-known people, to Russia to propagate the idea of Zionism and to actually, if you like, in an attempt to Zionize Russian Judaism. And the person that they sent there was somebody called Haschler. And he went, he'd obviously read his Bible there, he met Leo Pinsker, and he said, there is something that you have not mentioned in your book, which was called Auto-Emancipation, namely that God had promised the land of Israel to Abraham and his children, right? And even then, Pinsker was not very convinced that it was a good idea to have a state in Palestine. And Haschler was somebody who maintained very close contacts with Herzl. And from the moment that Herzl had written his book, Judenstaat, up to the time of his death in 1904, he was in very, very close contact with Herzl. Haschler was also working in the British Embassy in Budapest, because Herzl was an Hungarian Jew and met Herzl very, very frequently. And he was somebody who introduced Herzl to very important people like Tsar of Russia, Kaiser of Germany, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and two Russian ministers, Witta and Pleve. Pleve was a famous anti-Semite who had organized a lot of anti-Semitic pogroms in Russia. He introduced them, and Herzl will tell them all that they wanted to hear every time he met any one of them. And eventually, during the Second World War, the Jews in Palestine established literally a semi-government in Palestine, and they were allowed to do by the British Mandate Authority, which the Palestinians were not allowed. Once the Palestinians realized that Britain was allowing a large number of Jewish immigrants to come into Palestine, they realized that their own state was in danger, so they rose in rebellion. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but at the same time, Britain promised to stop further immigration. And that, of course, put them in contradiction with the Zionists in Palestine. And the Zionists had various terrorist groups, like the Stern Gang and one or two others. And somebody who became subsequently Prime Minister of Israel, Begin, was leader of the Stern Gang. And in response to British restrictions on immigration, they murdered the British representative in Cairo, Lord Moyne. They murdered 2 British soldiers in Palestine as a revenge for the execution of 2 Zionist terrorists in Palestine. And most famously, or infamously, they bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was the headquarters of the British Army, killing quite a few people. And by this time, Britain, having empowered the Zionists, finding itself unable to control, simply passed on the buck to the United Nations and announced that was 1947, announced its intention to leave Palestine. And of course, the day it left, the day after that, Ben Gurion announced the creation of a Palestinian state. And the
announced an Israeli state.
Announced the formation of an Israeli state. And this partition plan had been agreed at the United Nations. And as soon as the state was announced, through the sheer terror, the Israeli Zionists drove out something like 700,000 or 750,000 Palestinians off their homes, land, businesses, etc. And their descendants continue to live in refugee camps up to today. And they're demanding the right of return. And they continue to struggle, and they have not forgotten the land of Israel. One other thing that is very important to remember is that the Zionists during the Second World War collaborated not only in Germany, but elsewhere as well with the Hitlerites. And they were responsible for actually persuading the Jews in Hungary, there were about 800,000 Jews in Hungary, to quietly depart what actually turned out to be concentration camps, by telling them they were going to a holiday camp. And this had worked out by the SS in collaboration with the Jewish agency's agent in Hungary, somebody called Rudolf Kästner. And all he demanded in return from them was that a few of his chosen people, about 6,000 of them, mainly the top echelons of the Zionist establishment, should be allowed to board the train from Budapest to Palestine, if you like, while the rest boarded their train to concentration camps, believing they were going to some holiday camp. And this was justified by the Zionists on the grounds that nothing could be done about them. They were withering on the vine. They were not ideologically firm, i.e. they were not Zionists. Hungarian Jews were very liberal, and they didn't give 2 hoots about Zionism. So the Zionists didn't really worry about that. That was their shameful role. And this was actually confirmed by the Israeli district court in Jerusalem, that is precisely what had happened. But then the Israeli government launched an appeal against that decision very, very quickly, within 24 hours, and got the verdict reversed. And the majority, of course, gave a verdict which justified Kästner's behavior, because not much could have been done about these Jews. They were going to die anyway. So why not save 6,000 people? And 6,000 were his friends and people who were top figures in the Zionist establishment. And the whole thing was exposed not only by writers like Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, but also by Zionists themselves. Zionists, they're called revisionist Zionists, who were of